Hi everyone, Samir and Samit here, and welcome back to our Formula One podcast.
Today we'll be talking about the 2023 Bahrain Grand Prix.
Yeah, and it wasn't certainly a bad race at all, but it was actually a pretty exciting race. But don't get me wrong, it wasn't the best race I've ever seen in F1, but it was a pretty good way to start off the season.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty moderate for what we'd expect from a season opener, but we did see a lot of good battles up and down the grid. And then obviously there were a few heartbreaks here and there. Papaya fans. But anyway, let's get into FP1 now. Finally, we've been waiting for so many months, and it's the first FP1 of the new season. And it was really nice once again to see the new 2023 cars back on track. I mean, we just had preseason testing, but you can never get too much of these new cars.
Yeah, certainly. I completely agree with you. But in terms of what they did throughout free practice, it was mostly like the same run plans as they did throughout testing, just testing the reliability, making sure the car runs how it's supposed to, make sure nothing is breaking, but just a little bit more push laps to prepare them for qualifying. So we saw a lot more soft tire runs with all of the drivers so that they could get that valuable data of how quick their car was before qualifying and also how to set it up properly for qualifying.
And we also saw Lance Stroll return to the Formula One
Yep.
paddock after his bike accident. He was able to return, and there were a lot of speculations about who would replace him. Felipe Drugovich was obviously the main one that they finally announced that they would be replacing them with. But then there was maybe even the likes of Sebastian Vettel making a shock return to Aston Martin.
Yeah, I don't think Vettel would have come back. I think he definitely was just gonna retire for good. I don't think he would have come back. But I feel like even after the end result of the race and the performance of Stroll, I feel like they should have still just given Drogovic a chance because he did the whole preseason testing with them, and so he obviously had a lot more experience of the car compared to Lance Stroll, and he was 100% fit where Stroll wasn't, but it's still a really good job by Stroll.
Yeah, obviously he had those two pins in his wrist, and we saw an FP1 that made him really hard to like turn the steering wheel. It was like really difficult for him.
Yeah.
It gave him quite a lot of pain actually. So he had to take his hand instead of putting his thumb through the thumb hole of the steering wheel. He had to put it around the bottom edge to turn it around to get enough rotation that he needed into turn one. So it was like a pretty big shock to see. I mean, we didn't know if Stroll would make a full recovery in time for the race because obviously that would cost you a lot of time. And his engineer was telling him that it did cost him time, but Stroll was just saying that he couldn't do anything because it was too much pain for him.
Yeah, I think the doctor said that his predicted return would be in Australia. So also a really good job from the doctors and all his medical staff there, treating him well and taking care of him, performing the surgery quickly and properly to get him back out on the track to perform. And especially with the result he got, that they deserve a lot of credit for that result.
Yeah, and it's not like Stroll was always off the pace when he first returned to the paddock. I mean, in FP1 we see here he was sixth in the final standings of FP1, so it was still really good. It was still a really good performance for him in terms of especially with his hand and not even driving a single mile in this new car. So it was pretty good showing from him.
Yeah, in FP1 we did see some few mistakes from some drivers, like Carlos Sainz, for example. Into turn 9, he lost the rear end of his Ferrari and he went into a full 360-degree spin. It was caused by the bump there. Obviously, turn 9 is a really tricky downhill left turn and like really hard braking zone. You have to time your braking perfectly if you don't want to lock up because it's really easy to lock up the front left in that corner. So there was a bump there and it caught out a few drivers too, Sainz being one of them. And it just, as soon as he went over the bump, he just lost the rear of the car and it spun around on him.
We also saw another off moment from Oscar Piastri in the turn 6-7 area where he just lost the rear kind of, but he was able to save it. But he just took a whole lot of that rough outside curb and that just completely scraped the floor of his McLaren. But there wasn't too bad of damage, but it was obviously a nasty shock for him. But he was able to save the car and continue, so that was good reflexes from him.
Yep, yeah. So at the end of FP1, it was actually the Red Bull of Sergio Perez who finished ahead and on top in P1. So Sergio Perez was looking really good in his Red Bull, showing that the preseason testing advantage that he had was being put to good use. And it was Fernando Alonso who finished in second, 4 tenths off the Red Bull.
L
So
plan working.
yeah, so the preseason testing rumors about Aston Martin being as quick as they were finally showing that they might be even more true than we thought, because preseason testing they were just rumors obviously, but now we're actually seeing some definite pace from Fernando Alonso, and also with Stroll in sixth. So it's not just Fernando Alonso, it's also the Aston Martin car that they've actually hit their development on point. And also in P3, then it was Max Verstappen in the other Red Bull. So Verstappen not as quick as Perez, but definitely not slow at all. And Lando Norris actually surprisingly in fourth place, ahead of the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc. So Lando Norris showing some good pace, even though he was 1.4 seconds off Sergio Perez. That was still good enough to finish fourth.
And then we saw Charles Leclerc in fifth place. I mean, Ferrari, they did look kind of quick in preseason testing, but now we see here, I mean, Leclerc fifth behind not only a McLaren and Aston Martin, obviously, and then the two Red Bulls. So, be behind that McLaren might have been a shock for him, but again, they could have just been on different plans. I mean, Norris was probably pushing and Leclerc wasn't, so it might have not been
Yeah,
too
yeah.
bad for Leclerc, but still we'd never want to see Ferraris that low, especially with this McLaren maybe predicted not to be the best car on the grid this year. And then we saw Lance Stroll sixth, like we just talked about him before. Incredible result from him in FP1 with his hand and everything. And then came Kevin Magnussen in seventh in the Haas. So another good showing from him. I mean, it was really impressive to see how he was able to really push the car around this track. I mean, we knew the Haas wasn't that competitive last year, but Kevin Magnussen looks like maybe he can push for more points this year, and Nico Hulkenberg can maybe bring that Haas relationship together and get more points.
Yeah, adding on to what you said about Ferrari too, this is a really a make or break year for them with all the management changes that they've done down at Maranello, and especially coming off the really rough year they had last year. In fact, the last 3 years they've had, of course, 2020, then 2021, and then 2022, where they had a quick car but just poor strategy. This is really a make or break year for them, because they have two really talented drivers, and those talented drivers want to be fighting for the championship every single race weekend. I'm sure there's a lot of other teams that are willing to pick them up if Ferrari don't step up their game.
hmm Now we see eighth consistency from Joe Guan Yu, consistent midfield finisher. I mean, he wasn't able to find points a lot last season, but maybe he can this year with the new Alfa Romeo car, and it's looking pretty quick because right behind him is Valtteri Bottas ninth, and then Lewis Hamilton 10th, and George Russell was just behind Hamilton. So Mercedes not showing the pace that they hope to show after preseason testing. So really disappointing from Mercedes, but they would be looking to improve throughout the weekend.
Yep. So now moving on to FP2 then, and the first night run of the weekend for them, and a lot of teams we saw now some real pace from the teams as they did soft tire runs to get that data in and to get that simulations in, because these conditions are very similar to qualifying. And surprisingly, it was Fernando Alonso, P1, ahead of Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez, and the Red Bulls were both 1 tenth off the Aston Martin, so it was close. But Fernando Alonso still managing to extract a lot of pace out of that Aston Martin in qualifying like simulation conditions.
Yeah, this was really exciting to see because obviously we want Fernando Alonso to be up the grid. I mean, we knew he could always push a car whether it was uncompetitive or not. But to see this competitive Aston Martin and him in first after he's pushing it in qualifying like simulations, that gave us a lot of excitement as to what could come during qualifying. But now
Yep.
behind the two Red Bulls, it was Charles Leclerc and the Ferrari again lagging behind both Red Bulls. He was 3 tenths off them. So
Yeah, and
maybe
4 tenths off the Aston Martin too.
yeah, maybe it might just be lack of regular pace for Leclerc. I mean, if these are qualifying like simulations, and he's 3 tenths off the Red Bulls and Aston Martin, then it might spell disaster for Ferrari in Bahrain. And then we saw Nico Hulkenberg in fifth. Great effort from him in his Haas to get it up into fifth, ahead of again sixth place Lance Stroll with his pins in his wrist and all that. So that was still another good effort from him. And then we saw Pierre Gasly in his first FP2 for Alpine. He was seventh, so that was good from him, getting used to the car, obviously still. But to be seventh in FP2, it was good, but there was still more work that needed to be done with him. And then Lewis Hamilton eighth, small improvement in the Mercedes, and Lando Norris ninth. I mean, it shows that he could potentially extract that McLaren into the points, but we might not know because Joe Guan Yu is 10th too, and the Alfa Romeos are looking really quick this weekend.
Yeah, it's really tight between the midfield too, so it's going to definitely be a big fight to get those points. Qualifying will be one thing, but we've seen teams in the past have really good qualifying pace, but not a lot of race pace, and they've just been falling back. So that's what we need to see. That's the team that has the most race pace, the best race pace, is going to be the team that's going to score the points and win the midfield.
Yeah, I mean, Red Bull look to be that team right now, even though they had some issues with both drivers not feeling a bit happy with the car in FP2. They could look to iron it out in FP3 and then potentially find that sweet spot for qualifying and the race.
Yeah, well, Red Bull, obviously, they have really good of both aspects. They have really good qualifying pace and race pace, too. Yeah, so I don't think it's going to be an issue for them. But for teams like McLaren, Williams, Haas, Alfa Romeo, it's all for them because it's really tight between them. I think Red Bull still have a significant advantage over the rest of the field.
Yeah. Now let's go to FP3, the final chance for the drivers to perfect their setups for qualifying. And the man that looked like he perfected his setup was Fernando Alonso, as again he finished first in his Aston Martin. But 5 thousandths behind him was reigning world champion Max Verstappen. So it looked like it would be a really close battle between Alonso and Verstappen for pole position. And maybe even Perez could get in there. But I think that was just all that could have challenged them.
Yeah. FP3 was like the last chance for them to get their good setups in, and Lewis Hamilton finished in fourth too, behind both of the Red Bulls, 2 tenths off the Aston Martin, and only 1 tenth off the Red Bull. So maybe Mercedes are having some pace, and maybe they're not as slow as everyone thinks they are.
Yeah, Mercedes in FP3. I mean, Hamilton was complaining about his rear tires getting a bit too hot, and he was just sliding around all over the place. So Mercedes probably a bit worried because that's not something you can really change throughout the weekend if you have a big issue like your rear tires consistently getting too hot.
Yeah, it's just too late for that. It's just too late in the weekend before that for them to fix any issues like that.
Yeah, you need to you need to have upgrades in order to fix those issues, and right now they can't really do anything besides minor changes. But that wasn't good news for Hamilton or Mercedes because rear tires just sliding around means you can't get on the power early enough. You can't get a good exit out of any corners. And so that would spell disaster for Mercedes if they couldn't get those issues solved in time for qualifying.
Yeah, that's especially necessary for DRS attacks too. You need a really good exit coming out of the corner to get that boost of DRS to help you a lot, because it doesn't matter if you have DRS. If you don't get a good exit, you'll still be a long way behind the car. Even with battery, you may be able to get it, but most likely you won't. So the exit is really important, and you need to have good traction and good low tire wear, low rear tire wear for that.
Yeah, I mean, even though Lewis Hamilton was complaining about that, he still finished fourth, which was promising a little bit for Mercedes, and Leclerc again fifth, lacking behind everyone else. So not good, not a good few FPs for Leclerc, but we'd see whether he turned up in qualifying or not. And then George Russell came sixth. So in terms of placement, a significant improvement for Mercedes, but again, probably not realistic of what's to come in qualifying.
Yeah, because the times we saw the Mercedes put in qualify in FP3 were 132s, whereas the times we saw in FP2, the fastest time was a 130. So it's still 2 seconds off the pace. So Mercedes in the right positions, but not at the right time.
Exactly. And Stroll again seventh. I mean, still way behind Fernando Alonso, but when you look at his wrist situation, it's a pretty decent effort from him. And then Carlos Sainz if you thought Leclerc was lacking, then Sainz majorly lacking, then Sainz needs to really pick up the pace. And if he wants to step up with Leclerc,
Yeah, well, I mean, it's Fernando Alonso too. It doesn't matter how good of a driver you are, unless you're
true.
Lewis Hamilton. It's Fernando Alonso. It's really hard to beat him.
True, true. And then Oscar Piastri ninth, so into the top 10 did the rookie go, and then Gasly 10th in the Alpine in his first FP3 for the French outfit.
Yeah, so now let's move on to qualifying too, and the big moment that everyone has been waiting for so far this weekend. So first off, in Q1, immediately when we saw the Ferrari go out onto the track, the red car on the track, immediately red flag out. As soon as we saw the red car go out and he braked into turn one, a thing broke off the car. Instead of braking properly, a thing broke off the car. It was the wheel cover that if you notice this thing that goes over the wheel like that, this bottom part right here next to the suspension, that fell off, and so the aerodynamics didn't work properly, and that caused them to lock up into turn one, and the debris that was left on the track is what caused the red flag.
Yeah, you might not think that the wheel cover is a really important part for the car, but it provides a lot of cooling to the brakes. And so because of that, air wasn't being like guided to the brakes, and so due to that part not being off, the brakes were just really hot, and that made Leclerc like lock up everywhere. He couldn't brake properly, so he had to box immediately to get that fixed. But also everyone had to box because it was a red flag. And classic Ferrari moment, first qualifying of the year, already breaking things.
Yeah, and that obviously, as you said, it hurt everyone else behind them, and so that will cause now, as we've seen in previous qualifyings, if there's a red flag in the beginning, that just causes a lot of drama at the end for the drivers trying to get those laps in. So obviously a red flag is not what anyone wanted, especially the drivers who were on laps, because that would have damaged the tires, and now just for nothing.
Yeah, and so one really big disappointment we saw in qualifying was Pierre Gasly. After showing some decent pace in the Alpine, he just couldn't hook up a lap together in qualifying, and it was a real shame for him to get last in his first qualifying for Alpine, and it was pretty disappointing from him because he thought he had pace throughout the FP sessions, but then in just qualifying, it was probably just a cumulative of things like Leclerc's red flag, him being out on track at the wrong
Yep.
time, traffic maybe. But either way, that didn't change the fact that Gasly would start 20th in his first race for Alpine.
Also, Nick DeFries too. All three rookies we saw get out in Q1. But first, with Nick DeFries too, just a poor qualifying from him in general. And then it's not the car too, because Yuki Tsunoda got into Q2, although barely. But Nick DeFries though in 19th for AlphaTauri, not showing that good of a performance as we've seen from him. Obviously at Monza last year too. And yes, the AlphaTauri is not that good of a car, but if Yuki Tsunoda was able to get it up, I mean Yuki Tsunoda is a really good driver, but Nick DeFries is also a really good driver too. So I feel like he should have got the car up higher. And then the second rookie, Oscar Piastri, just another poor, similar thing to Nick DeFries, just a poor performance and lack of extraction of pace from the car to finish in 18th. But the third rookie, Logan Sargent, actually, I think he had a really good
Yeah,
qualifying.
he was really impressive throughout Q1.
Yeah, throughout Q1 too, but he set the exact same time as Lando Norris too. That's what caused him to not make it through to Q2 was the fact that he set his lap time right after Lando Norris. So the rule is that if you set the exact same time, then the person who sets their laps the second time, or who goes after, who sets their time after the other car, that's the car that gets relegated, or who starts in the lower position. So in Logan Sargent's case, that was 16th and out of qualifying.
Yeah, but I mean, he should take that as a win because him, a rookie in a Williams versus Lando Norris, been in the sport for multiple years now in a McLaren, and Sargent going and setting the exact same time as him. That's a really good effort from the American.
Yeah, also, we're not just going to be fanboying Sargent too. Also, with Piastri and DeFries, I think they also deserve a chance to see how they're going to do in the race, and how they how they're gonna do throughout the rest of the season, because obviously both of them are Formula Two champions and Sargent is not, so they're obviously really good drivers
Yeah,
who are on their
exactly.
way to F1. So we'll just have to give them time.
Yeah, exactly. So now going into Q2 now, and the drivers again trying to push themselves all the way around the track as fast as they can. But one man who really couldn't hook it up together was Alex Albon. I mean, it was disappointing from him. He didn't even get a lap time in, and that was unfortunate from him because the Williams did look to have really good pace, but they were faced with an issue which couldn't get Albon out onto the track properly.
Yeah, but along with Albon, the people who got out were Sonoda, Joe Guan Yu, Valtteri Bottas. So both Alfa Romeos out, and then Lando Norris with an impressive qualifying in 11th, just missing out on Q3.
Yeah, he really dragged that McLaren all the way up there. I mean, I thought for sure both McLarens were going to get knocked out in Q3 after preseason testing. They just looked woefully off the pace. But Norris dragging up onto the fringes of the top 10, that's a really good effort from him.
Yeah, so now moving on into Q3 then, and a really exciting Q3, even though it was like more of the same results at the end. But the drivers then finally got their chance to push to the maximum limit and to see how where they could put their car. And in the end, it was car number one who finished in P1. Max Verstappen took a pole position in Bahrain again. So for his first pole in Bahrain since 2021 when he took the pole that year, and it was a Red Bull front row lockout with Sergio Perez finishing in P2 just behind his teammate. Then it was an all Ferrari second row with Leclerc, surprisingly, and really good performance from him to finish in third, ahead of Sainz in fourth.
Yeah, I mean, we saw Leclerc though. He looked quick at the beginning of Q3, and then all of a sudden, towards the end, we saw him get out of the car, and we were like, what is going on? And then we found out later he had an issue with his control electronics, so he couldn't attempt his last lap, and that meant like he couldn't improve and try to go for pole. He was second, and then Perez got him, so that dropped him down to third. So it was disappointing for Leclerc at the start of the season. Ferrari reliability already letting him down. So that was really disappointing from him. And also a bit of a disappointment, Fernando Alonso fifth in his Aston Martin. But then
Yeah.
again, I mean, 12 months ago, would we have ever thought to see an Aston Martin in the top five?
Nope.
Exactly. So good effort from Fernando Alonso to get his Aston Martin up into fifth place. And then we saw both Mercedes, Russell ahead of Hamilton, Russell sixth and Hamilton seventh. So it was good from the Mercedes. I mean, they were right up there. But then, I mean, if you look like their times compared to the Red Bulls, they were like George Russell was almost 6 tenths behind Max Verstappen.
Yeah.
So that was really disappointing from Mercedes. But at the same time, sixth and seventh, if they had a good race car, they could carve their way through the field.
Yeah, and also a big congrats to Lance Stroll in eighth with for Aston Martin. A really good qualifying from him, just behind the two Mercedes and ahead of the Alpine of Esteban Ocon and the Haas of Nico Hulkenberg. Nico Hulkenberg, who was able to get his Haas up into the Q3. That was a really good performance from him, even though he didn't get a lap in Q3. But his teammate, if you look at Kevin Magnussen, couldn't even get out of Q1, and Nico Hulkenberg got his Haas into Q3. So it'll be a really good starting position for him to capitalize and maybe score some points in the race.
Yeah, it was obviously a really good effort from Hulkenberg in his first qualifying for Haas, whereas Kevin Magnussen, multiple qualifyings for Haas. I mean, so Magnussen probably did feel pretty embarrassed, but at the same time, everyone knows that Hulkenberg is a good driver. So it was pretty exciting to see what Hulkenberg could do in the Haas.
Yeah, so now moving on to the race then. The thing everyone was looking forward to. At lights out, we saw a really good start from Max Verstappen, who shot into the lead then, ahead of his teammate Sergio Perez, who actually had a pretty poor start and was getting challenged by both Ferraris into turn one. It was Leclerc who we saw challenging Sergio Perez, and Sainz was also getting involved. But towards turn two and three, it was Verstappen in the lead then, ahead of Leclerc, then Perez, and Perez tried to fight him back coming into the turn four, but instead was nearly challenged by Carlos Sainz. But down the hill as they went, it was Verstappen ahead of Leclerc, then Perez, and then Sainz. But at turn 4, we also saw a controversial collision between Lance Stroll and Fernando
It was
Alonso.
a pretty scary moment for Aston Martin there. They could have both been knocked out of the race right there, but luckily the gods were favoring them that day, and so they were able to continue.
Yeah, luckily nothing really happened with them. It was just Stroll missed his braking point, couldn't get the car slowed down in time. It was also Alonso taking a really wide line and then coming back in. But luckily then he was able to get everything under control and Aston Martin settled into their positions.
Yeah, but because of that, then Alonso got jeopardized by that, and so he fell into the fringes of the Mercedes. And
Yeah.
so Russell was able to overtake him, and Hamilton was now challenging the Ferraris up ahead. So it wasn't the start that Alonso wanted.
Yeah, but Alonso was luckily able to get past George Russell later, as on lap 13 he was gaining close towards George Russell. He sized up a move into turns 1 and 2, but he wasn't able to get them there. But then he used the aid of the next DRS zone, and this was like what we were talking about earlier with the good exits, how necessary they were. Russell didn't get a really good exit. Alonso got a really good exit, and even before they opened the DRS, he was already next to the Mercedes before he passed them into turn 4, and it was a really good move and a really important move too. But that was on lap 13, so we also saw multiple pit stops from cars that had already happened. So the first driver to make a pit stop was Pierre Gasly. On lap 9, he made a pit stop. And also, one lap later, we saw the McLaren of Lando Norris make his first pit stop of what will be many, many pit stops this race because they had an issue with the car.
Yeah, really disappointing for McLaren about that. And also going back to the Alonso Russell fight, it was good from Alonso to overtake him, but it was also fair play to Russell because Russell had a really good fight back. He fought him back all the way around turn 4, but in the end he just had to concede because his tires were going off and Alonso was able to preserve his more.
Yeah, and so the issue with Norris was that they had to keep refilling his pneumatic air in his car, so that he would have to keep coming in and into the pits every time to fill up the air that was needed in his car. So that was just he was not happy about that, I bet. But also Yuki Tsunoda, then he came into the pits along with Bottas, Albon, Hulkenberg, De Vries, Hamilton, Ocon, Sargent, and Joe as well. And then on lap 13 as well, we saw both Ferraris come into the pits too, of Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz too. And then the Mercedes of George Russell went in onto on lap 13. So that whole window between laps 11 and laps 15, we saw the drivers come into the pits one by one.
And we saw Russell have really good pace on his hard tires, and he looked to maybe possibly be challenging Alonso on lap 16, but he wasn't able to. Alonso could pull away, and pulled away he did, and he overtook Valtteri Bottas round the outside at turn 4 on lap 17, and so that was really good from Alonso. And right after that, on lap 18, came Russell. Russell was overtaking Bottas, so that was good. Russell was keeping pace with Alonso, and he was able to try to fight that back, but he wasn't able to overtake him into turn 1. So once again, using that turn 3 straight DRS, Russell was able to power past the Alfa Romeo.
Yeah, with the fresh tires and a good exit. And then we saw after that on lap 26 a battle for second place between Sergio Perez and Charles Leclerc. Leclerc on new hard tires, Perez on new soft tires after making his stop on lap 17. And so we saw Perez make the move down the inside at turn 1, but Leclerc tried to get a switchback and tried to get him up the hill, but it just wasn't enough as Perez was able to keep his position in second place ahead of Leclerc.
And where was Verstappen, you might ask? Verstappen was 10 seconds away.
While 13 seconds away.
While all of this was happening, Verstappen just took off. Like, he took off from lights out, and he never looked back throughout these series of pit stops. He was consistently 10 seconds ahead of whoever was second place, whether it was Perez or Leclerc. So Verstappen just had almighty pace. Not even his own teammate could keep up with him in the same car. So that just showed the dominance of Verstappen, and it might be a foreshadowing of what was to come, what's maybe to come this season.
Yeah, I mean, we even saw it towards the end. I saw some videos about the team radios asking Max Verstappen to slow down. So it seems like there's even more pace that Verstappen could have used. So It's not looking like a good year if you're Ferrari, but it's looking like another really good year if you're a Red Bull
Yeah.
fan or Red if you work at Red Bull too. But then on lap 32, we saw the next round of pit stops. We saw George Russell come into the pits then, along with Carlos Sainz as well, and that whole sequence of pit stops came in throughout that. We also saw other drivers like Sargent, Stroll, Hamilton, Bottas, and Norris come in to make their pit stops for the second round of pit stops too. Especially if you were on the softs, we saw a soft to hard pit stop strategy. But if you were on the hards, we just saw them go to the end.
Yep, and Russell came into the pits and he was right he came out right into the path of Lance Stroll, and Stroll though on the hotter tires because he had made his pit stop earlier.
Yeah.
So Stroll was able to overtake him again using that turn 3 DRS, which has proved to be the best point of overtaking for most of the drivers. So Stroll was able to get ahead of Russell going into turn 4, and it was an important move for Stroll.
Yep, that was a really good move from Stroll and necessary for also Aston Martin too, because they needed both cars up as high as they could so that they could get as many points as they needed to start the season off properly.
And then another Aston Martin and Mercedes battle. This time it was the other drivers. On lap 37, we saw Alonso size up Hamilton into turn 1, but he just stayed ahead. And then using the turn 3 DRS zone, he did try to overtake him. He went down the inside, but then he went a bit deep and he had a lot of oversteer on the exit.
Yeah.
So his tires just slid all over the place. He wasn't actually going forward, and he had to counter steer that. So he had to turn basically left into a right hander, and that allowed Hamilton through again.
Yeah, this was the issue what we were talking about in free practice earlier, where the Mercedes was complaining about losing the rear tires so easily, and we saw that especially from the Aston Martin too this time around. But Hamilton was luckily able to capitalize from that. So that's what we were saying about how a good exit is really necessary to pull off a move or to keep a position.
It was also highly unlikely to see. I mean, Alonso had been making moves like that all day, and his tires weren't necessarily that degraded, but it was pretty strange. He might have just overcooked it on the brakes, and
Yeah.
he just couldn't stop it. So, but either way, Hamilton was through then, but Alonso would size him up later, and Alonso was eventually able to get past on lap 38. It was a brilliant overtake into turn 9. He dummied Hamilton that he would go to the outside,
Yeah,
and
that
then he
was a really
switched
good
down
move.
the inside at the hill, and it was superb braking from Alonso and a brilliant overtake. He caught Lewis Hamilton absolutely napping. And
He even got the DRS too to pull away from Hamilton too. So that was like a perfectly timed move.
it was a sensational move from Alonso. I feel like that was the best move of the race. In my
Yeah,
opinion.
by far, by far.
That was a really good move.
Also, a really good move coming from a Red Bull fan on lap 41. It was really good to see Leclerc's engine blow up in the first race of the season.
I mean, what it's Ferrari at this point. What did we expect? I'm honestly surprised that Sainz didn't have to retire too. I mean, the only good news is that maybe Leclerc can avoid the Bahrain curse, but then again,
Yeah, I mean, Max Verstappen breaking a lot of records so far. Maybe he can break this one too.
yeah, it was really disappointing for Leclerc, and obviously that meant now Leclerc would have to change his power unit, but we found out it was just the control electronics that needed to be changed. But here's the thing, they changed that before the race, and you're only allocated 2 control electronics every year,
Oh,
and so that means that only after one race Ferrari have used up their entire allocation of control electronics for Leclerc. I mean, it was pretty embarrassing for a team like Ferrari already with this much reliability for Leclerc's car. Thankfully, Sainz didn't suffer that much, but I mean, their number one man, Leclerc, you never want to see things like that, especially at the first race of the year.
yeah. But luckily Leclerc was smart and he parked it in a position where they could just push the car back off into the escape road. So there was no need for a safety car. There was just a yellow flag. But later on after that, we saw a move from the Alpine of Pierre Gasly getting past the Williams of Logan Sargent. So that was a really good move from Gasly. And Gasly was on a charge this weekend, trying to get as many positions as he could and salvage some points after starting at the back of the grid.
And then after that, we saw this 3-car scrap between the Alfa Romeo and the 2 Alpines. or the two Alpha Tauris. So it was
Yeah.
Sonoda trying to get past Bottas and his teammate De Vries. So Sonoda just let Bottas go into turn one, and then he just got run round the outside at turn two. Did Sonoda, and then he sized up De Vries down to turn three straight, and it's a really good move from Sonoda to take two cars within a couple of corners.
Yeah, and so obviously after Leclerc had his engine blow up, now this put Sainz into third place, but Sainz wasn't looking the quickest, but you know who was looking quick behind him? Fernando Alonso was looking quick behind him, and by lap 45, Alonso was putting a supreme amount of pressure on his fellow Spaniard, and towards turn 4 then he tried to get the move done on lap 45, but instead he ended up hitting Sainz, but luckily there was no damage done, just a tap from the left front wing of Fernando Alonso to the right rear wheel of Sainz, but it was all the same down the hill towards the 6 and 7 chicane. Alonso was trying to size up more moves, but he just wasn't able to get it done till the DRS zone where Sainz locked up, and that allowed Alonso to now get a really good exit with the use of DRS and his battery. He was able to get ahead of Carlos Sainz and up into third place in an Aston Martin.
That was unbelievable to see. I mean, Alonso on the podium in the Aston Martin in the podium position. That was incredible. And going back to that three-car battle, it was actually the Alfa Romeo of Zhou Guan Yu that Sonoda was able to overtake. And then Sonoda overtook also his teammate Nick De Vries.
Yep, so after all of that, and after a lot of Lando Norris pit stops, after Oscar Piastri had to retire from the race,
Precisely 6 pit stops from Lando Norris. And
yeah,
just to let you know, the next most amount of pit stops was 3. Norris finished a minute behind the race leader.
yeah, and obviously, as I mentioned, too, Oscar Piastri retiring too due to an issue where they had to change the steering wheel and the car just wouldn't start after that. So not a good start to the season at all for McLaren to have one car retire and to have one car finish a minute behind. But it was a really good start to the season for the reigning constructors champions and the reigning world champion Max Verstappen, as he won the Bahrain Grand Prix for the first time in his career, and he started the season off perfectly, finishing 11 seconds ahead of his teammate Sergio Perez to make it a Red Bull 1-2 in the desert, and coming home in third place to complete the podium. Fernando Alonso on debut for Aston Martin, he weaved
Sensational
across the
result from
line.
him.
He weaved across the line to claim third place and his first podium for Aston Martin, and their second in their history, and their second in the modern era too. So a really good result from Aston Martin, confirming their pace, and just an excellent way to start the start the season for them.
And then Carlos Sainz came fourth. A pretty okay result from him in the Ferrari,
Yeah.
salvaging points on what could have been a better weekend for Ferrari had it not been their reliability. Overall, though, pretty disappointing from them. And then came Lewis Hamilton fifth. I mean, Toto Wolff said after the race, though, it was probably the hardest day he's ever had in his
I don't blame
motorsport
him.
career.
Yeah, I
It
don't
was
blame him.
pretty disappointing from a team like Mercedes with Hamilton fifth and Russell seventh, because they were nowhere near the pace that they wanted to be, especially when you looked at like Red Bull's pace. Hamilton finished 50 seconds behind Verstappen, and Russell
Yeah.
finished 55 seconds behind from Verstappen. So clearly Mercedes had a lot of work they needed to do, but it was a pretty okay result with Hamilton fifth, Stroll sixth. A great effort from him
Yeah.
throughout this whole weekend, consistently sixth place and another sixth place in the race. So that was good. More points for Aston Martin, which actually helped them put them second in the constructors
Yeah, they're
standings.
second in the constructor championship now.
That's
Aston
absolutely
Martin.
insane, incredible. And then Russell seventh, and then we saw the Alfa Romeo of Bottas eighth. I think we expected Alfa Romeo to have a bit more pace, but you
I
can't
think
complain
8
with
is kind
that.
of what I expected them to be, though, because like with the other 4 teams ahead of them, 8th is decent. But another round of applause for Pierre Gasly from the back of the grid to finish in P9 to pick up 2 points on his Alpine debut to come home with points. That was amazing. And keep the applause going too for Alex Albon, who took his Williams into P10 to grab 1 point
That
for
was really
Williams as
good.
well. So a really good result from them. Sonoda finished in 11th. Logan Sargent on his debut finished in P12. I think a really good drive from him, and one he should definitely be
He should
proud
be
of.
really proud of that too. He had some really good battles and some good overtaking.
Yep. Then Kevin Magnussen in P13 for Haas, ahead of Nick de Vries, a good showing from the rookie as well, ahead of Hulkenberg in 15th. So Haas cars just dropping back through the order, not able to pick up any points. Ahead of the next Alfa Romeo of Zhou Guanyu, then Lando Norris, 2 laps behind the race leader after a lot of pit stops. He finished in 17th. And then the 3 DNFs we had were Ocon, Leclerc, and Piastri.
It was overall a really disappointing weekend for McLaren. I mean, they also had this disappointing weekend at the start of last year. This 2022 car not coming to them, but I bet they'll bounce back. I think
Yeah.
they'll bounce back.
We'll just have to wait and see till Jeddah. So thank you guys for listening to this episode of our podcast. And be sure to join us next time as we take a look at the 2023 Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Thank you.